The 1962 Nobel Prize in Medicine wasn't merely an award ceremony. It was the recognition of perhaps the most significant discovery in human history. Three people. Those three people had discovered the fundamental secret of life. However, for one of those individuals, life took a very bizarre turn later on. Filled with controversies, he lost all his achievements, eventually reaching a state where he had to sell his own Nobel Prize. Do you know what that Nobel-worthy discovery was? It was the double helix, the twisted ladder structure of DNA that designs every living thing on Earth, from a single bacterium to a giant blue whale, including you and me. Revealing this to the world marked the birth of modern biology. Among that group was James Watson, just 34 years old, with confidence shining in his eyes, perhaps even a hint of arrogance, a young American. From that moment, Watson's journey was strictly upward. He became a titan of the scientific world, the head of the historic Human Genome Project, and a synonym for the word genius. But behind this glittering success story, there are realities that don't shine quite as bright. That key, which unlocked the secret of life, they didn't find it alone. Rather, would you believe me if I told you they cunningly acquired it from someone else? What's even stranger is that decades later, this same James Watson was almost completely exiled from the scientific community. His honors were revoked, the very institutions he built disowned him. And it wasn't because of that old theft, but because of his later actions. He publicly argued that within the same DNA code he helped discover, there lies a dark message connecting human intelligence and race, implying that some races are inferior to others. This is a strange story. How did the person who revealed life's beautiful unity to the world become the spokesperson for the most dangerous ideas dividing humanity? The answer lies not just in the DNA code, but in the character of the humans who sought that code, in their competition and in their injustice. To understand the full picture of the events I mentioned at the start, we must travel back to the 1950s. It was a time of fierce competition in the scientific world to discover life's genetic blueprint. The prevailing belief at the time was that proteins were the molecules passing traits to future generations. This was because proteins are complex molecules made of 20 different amino acids. Many believed that only such complexity could hold the diverse information of life. Meanwhile, DNA existed inside the cell, but it had a simple structure repeating just 4 basic units: A, T, G, and C. Therefore, many scientists believed DNA could not carry genetic information and played only a structural role. Even after Oswald Avery's 1944 experiments gave strong hints that DNA was the genetic material, the scientific world hadn't fully accepted that conclusion. 3 main research teams were working toward this goal. In America, there was the famous chemist Linus Pauling. At Cambridge University, focusing more on theoretical models than experiments, were James Watson and Francis Crick. The third group was at King's College in London. That is where the critical experiments were taking place. The key researcher in this group was Rosalind Franklin. She was a woman. She had unique expertise in a technique called X-ray crystallography. This involves passing X-ray beams through a crystal and analyzing the patterns formed on photographic film to create a molecule's 3D shape. After months of hard work, in May 1952, Rosalind Franklin and her student Raymond Gosling captured an image of DNA. That image, known as Photograph 51, was a milestone in scientific history. Though it might look blurry to the untrained eye, that X-shaped image provided clear information about DNA structure. Franklin realized a helix structure. By analyzing the spots in the picture, she concluded that the molecule's sugar phosphate backbone was on the outside. From the measurements in that pattern, she even calculated the precise dimensions of the helix. Franklin's experimental data held all the basic information needed to determine the DNA structure. However, because Franklin was a scientist of extreme caution, she wanted to gather more evidence to confirm it beyond a shadow of a doubt before publishing her findings. This is where Watson and Crick from Cambridge entered the scene. They had ideas, but they lacked the experimental data to prove them. They knew that Franklin and her colleague at King's College, Maurice Wilkins, possessed the crucial data. In early 1953, when James Watson visited King's College, Maurice Wilkins showed him photograph 51 without Rosalind Franklin's permission. The moment he saw that image, Watson was convinced their helix idea was correct. On top of this, Another event occurred. Max Perutz, a senior scientist at Cambridge, had received a report on the research progress at King's College. This report included Franklin's unpublished data and calculations in detail. Perutz handed this report to Crick. With this, Watson and Crick had all the necessary information: the visual proof from photograph 51, the precise measurements from Franklin's report, and their own theoretical knowledge. The detail in Franklin's data about a specific symmetry group helped Crick understand that the two DNA strands run in opposite directions or are anti-parallel. With that, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Using this information, Watson and Crick built the accurate 3D model of DNA within days. In 1953, they published their findings in the famous scientific journal Nature. At the end of that paper, they simply noted that the unpublished findings of Franklin and Wilkins had stimulated their ideas. But later, the world and history would realize that rather than just inspiration, Franklin's data was the very foundation of their model. So, in 1962, Watson, Crick, and Wilkins received the Nobel Prize. But Rosalind Franklin, who played a critical role in this discovery, had died in 1958 at the age of 37 from ovarian cancer. Since the Nobel Prize is not awarded posthumously, she wasn't even considered for the award. After the DNA discovery, Franklin had conducted vital research on the structure of viruses. It was only after Watson wrote his book The Double-Helix, in which he spoke very negatively of Franklin, that the world began discussing the injustice she faced. Today, the scientific world fully acknowledges and discusses Rosalind Franklin's contributions to discovering the DNA structure. After the discovery of DNA, the lives of Francis Crick and James Watson went in two different directions. Francis Crick continued to make discoveries in molecular biology. He proposed the central dogma, the basic idea that genetic information flows from DNA to RNA to protein. Later, he turned to neuroscience and began studying human consciousness. James Watson led the Human Genome Project and turned the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, CSHL in New York, into a world-class research center. However, over time, he began to firmly believe in genetic determinism, the idea that human abilities and character are determined entirely by genes. The consequences of this thinking appeared in his public statements. In a 2007 interview with London's Sunday Times, he opined that people of African descent have genetically lower intelligence. This statement was a massive challenge to the scientific world and created an uproar. The scientific community rejected Watson's arguments not merely as a difference of opinion, but based on evidence discovered by science over decades. When we examine why Watson's arguments don't stand up scientifically, the depth of his error becomes clear. First, race is not a biological reality, it is a social construct. The very foundation of Watson's argument was flawed. He compared categories like Africans and whites. However, modern genetics proves that these traditional racial categories have no distinct biological borders. Physical features like skin color change gradually across regions without boundaries. This is called clinal variation. Furthermore, the genetic diversity between individuals within a race is often greater than the difference between two different races. Evidence from the Human Genome Project and other genetic studies refutes Watson's claims. If you take any two humans in the world, their DNA is 99.9% similar. The remaining 0.1% accounts for our physical diversity. There are no major genetic differences between races that determine a complex ability like intelligence. Since genes don't change that fast, it's found that factors like better education, nutrition, social security, and ecological factors influence intelligence. Finally, a psychological phenomenon called stereotype threat is relevant here. The existence of a misconception that one social group lacks ability can pressure individuals and cause them to underperform in competitions. In short, the explanation that everything is genetic, ignoring complex environmental and social factors, is incorrect. Because he tried to push this explanation, the modern scientific world considers Watson's stance as pseudoscience. Consequently, Watson's lectures were cancelled. He was removed from the leadership of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. Instead of admitting he was wrong, Watson argued he was being hunted by political influence. Finding himself financially isolated, In 2014, he put his Nobel Prize up for auction. It was the first time in history a living Nobel laureate sold their medal. Russian billionaire Alisher Usmanov bought it for $4.7 million, but then he gave it back to Watson. He stated it was tragic that a great genius was in a situation where he had to sell his achievements. However, even after this event, Watson's positions did not change. In a documentary released in 2019, Watson argued that his old racial views were still correct. Immediately following this, Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory revoked all his honorary titles. The very institution he built completely disowned him. This is the state of James Watson's later life, the same scientific confidence that urged him to use Rosalind Franklin's data without permission later led him to erroneous scientific conclusions. When the Human Genome Project, he led proved there are no racist differences between humans and that we are one human family, he argued the opposite. He failed to grasp the social meaning of the scientific truth he helped discover. Thus, the man who found the code of life failed to accept one of that code's basic messages, our shared human heritage. And so, on November 6th, 2025, at the age of 97, he bids farewell to this world. Just like many other scientists, this is the story of another scientist filled with eventful challenges. Thank you.